Oh, I can't. I can't. Okay, I'll forget that, so it'll probably end up on the floor. Okay, I'll just hold it. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sue Mann, and I am a researcher at AUT University. I'm a postdoc fellow and also a lecturer in neuropsychology and rehab psychology. And I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Rita Krishnamurthy, who is an epidemiologist. And the research I'm going to talk about today was actually conducted at Middlemore, so that's sort of why there's a bit of relevance here. And in particular, my research, which has been part of my PhD, has looked at cognition. So what I wanted to look at was what cognition looked at long-term with stroke. So people that had a stroke, I wanted to sort of follow them over a 3 to 4 year period to sort of see the trajectory and sort of what happens to them. So just a bit of background. So we know in New Zealand that around 7,000 to 8,000 people have strokes annually, and currently we have around, just a rough estimate, around 58,000 survivors. Now these are people obviously living in our communities with the effects of stroke. Previous studies, which was the ASTRO study, which was conducted in around 2007, did look at cognition, but it was a snapshot. So they looked at cognition sort of 5 years after stroke had happened, but they didn't sort of follow that trajectory. So we knew that cognitive impairment was quite significantly prevalent, but we didn't know the factors which affected cognition over time, and there was no sort of natural course of recovery. So as I just mentioned, I wanted to look at what happens to cognition post-stroke over time, and I also wanted to know this because I wanted this data able to inform cognitive rehabilitation. And we know currently at the moment there is very little cognitive rehab that goes on post-stroke. People get sort of physical rehab, they get speech and occupational, to get functional recovery, but we don't really look at cognition. So this current study was an extension of the Auckland Regional Community Outcomes Study, ARCOS. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the ARCOS studies. So these are huge epidemiology studies which we run every 10 years. This was the fourth one, which was conducted between 2011 and 2012. So we basically counted population-based prospective study every single person in Auckland that had a stroke, whether it was a new stroke, a recurrent stroke, over that year period between 2011 and 2012. And we used what's called a hot pursuit method, so we recruited predominantly out of hospitals, so the four major DHBs, so we used Counties Manukau, Auckland and Waitemata predominantly, with obviously North Shore and Waitakere hospitals. We also recruited through rest homes. We used Ministry of Health databases as well to capture people that had obviously passed away and people that we missed, GP practices, etc., and obviously rest homes, private hospitals. So consented participants, we collected a lot of demographic and clinical data at baseline, and then people that consented into that study we continued through to 12 months. So this particular study, my study, looked at these people at the 4 year mark. So I went out and reassessed these people at 4 years. So just a sort of overview of what we found that first year, if anyone was interested. So in the first, in the ARCOS 4 study, we found that around 2,096 people had strokes. This is excluding TIAs. There was about 800 on top of this that had TIAs. About around 1620 that had first ever strokes. And the total stroke incidence rate was around 149 people per 100,000. So for my study, out of this 2096, 821 had consented into the follow-up, which was at baseline 1, 6 and 12 months. And out of that, we had asked at their 12-month follow-up, who was interested in being continued to be followed up. And on those, we recorded around 500 people had agreed to be followed up. So I then phoned 500 people, or tried to get in contact with 500 people. And out of that 500, I managed to consent 257 into the follow-up. So what I wanted to do was look at, how cognition had changed over time. All of these people had basically, or a large amount of them, had completed the MOCA, which, if anyone is familiar with, is the Little Montreal cognitive assessment at these time points. So just quick overview of the methods. The sample was drawn from this cohort. I did do a chi-square analysis. I've already published off this paper just to look at whether my sample was representative of the total cohort, because often people look at it and say, well, okay, is the sample representative 257 people? And looking at all the demographic factors, it was predominantly, nothing came up as being significant. So at the 4 years, participants completed face-to-face cognitive assessments, the MOCA, at 1, 6, 12 and 48 months post-stroke. And demographic factors and stroke-related clinical risk factors, vascular risk factors, and also some outcome measures were all collected at baseline, because what I wanted to look at was what baseline factors predicted cognitive impairment at 4 years, and also what baseline factors affected the trajectory of who recovered and who predominantly got worse. And we did multivariate linear analysis, both univariate and logistic analysis. So just a very basic overview, quick overview of the results, the demographics. So at 4 years, out of the 499, 52% consented, which was a pretty good consent rate. 15% of that sample had passed away between the 12-month follow-up and the 4-year follow-up. As expected, predominantly the sample comprised of Europeans, 207, Maori, 12, that's the number, and Pacific, 7, and Asian and other, 31. So when we looked at the demographics, predominantly they were mostly over the age of 65, if you look at here. Most of them had had MCA strokes in subcortical regions, and predominantly most people were retired and unemployed. I just did a quick view of the hospital stats to give you a rough idea of in particular, my sample. So with the ARCOS 2000 sample, basically Auckland and Middlemore were the same. There were about 800 to 900 strokes that we incident rates in both hospitals, then North Shore and Waitakere. But for my sample, I recruited more from the North Shore than Auckland and Counties Manukau. And when you look at the mean score of the MOCA, so the total MOCA is out of 30. Counties Manukau was the second or third lowest score at 20.6. With North Shore having a mean score of 20.2. So that's quite low, even at 20, at 4 years post-stroke. That was the mean score for the MOCA. So, as I've just mentioned, mean score for the total sample was 20.7. Out of the 257, 216 were impaired, so they had a MOCA score of 26 or less. And that meant there was about 84% that had cognitive impairment. And when I looked at the mean score by ethnicity, Pacific actually had a mean score of 4 points lower than New Zealand Europeans, so they were quite significantly impaired. So when I looked at the time points, over time, I'll just quickly go through this. So at baseline, the mean MOCA score was 23.4, and by the time that they got to 4 years, it had dropped to 20.7. So it had decreased quite significantly over time by 2.8 points. When we looked at the predictors, predominantly people old age, which we would expect, male sex were more likely to be impaired, those who were unemployed, retired, singled, and vascular risk factors, coronary heart disease and arrhythmia were significantly associated with declining cognition at 4 years. Interestingly enough, those who had subarachnoid strokes actually improved over 4 years. Same set of predictors when we looked at time as the intercept were exactly the same with the trajectory when we're looking at cognition changing over time as the multivariate analysis. So the limitations, lack of a control group, obviously we couldn't compare to normal controls of the same age. We had no premorbid measure of cognition, so we don't know if people actually were previously impaired. And we only examined global cognition and not individual domains. The strength were that, we did have quite a nice sample size, which was representative of the full cohort, and it was population-based. So we know that, at 4 years, people's cognition is still not great. It does decline. Future resource, I do want to look at developing some normative data specific to our New Zealand demographics so that we can compare this in stroke populations. Looking what's currently used at the moment, we don't know with cognitive rehab, what is occurring with cognitive rehab. And also, this is what I'm conducting currently at the moment. I'm doing a little intervention which is looking at a computerised cognitive